Hey everybody, it's Fred Tweed, and welcome to Guitar Media's Fender Tweed amp video series. Today we're going to be taking a look at this 1968 Gibson ES335 and the 1954 Fender Tweed Super amp. Please stay tuned. A little later in the video we'll be going over circuit designs. Welcome to the circuit design section of this video. We'll be going over Fender Tweed amp gain stages, starting off with the 2 gain stage models, then moving on to the 3, 4, and 5 gain stage models, starting off with the Champ 5E1. A total of 2 gain stages in the preamp. The output of the first gain stage is in series with the second gain stage driving it. Moving on to the Fender Princeton 5D2 circuit. Once again, the first gain stage of the preamp is in series. The output is in series with the second gain stage driving it. We also see a tone control. Moving on to the Fender Deluxe 5C3. We see in the first valve, we see the inputs in parallel and the outputs are also in parallel. This equals a total of 1 gain stage for the first valve, and the second valve, which is the phase inverter, the inputs are in series but the outputs are in parallel, so this only equals another gain stage for this amplifier. Moving on to the Tremolux 5E9 circuit. The first valve here we see a total of 1 gain stage due to the parallel wiring design. The inputs are parallel and the outputs are also parallel, equaling 1 gain stage for that valve. The second valve here is the phase inverter in this Tremolux, and the outputs of this valve are in parallel, so it only equals 1 gain stage. The third valve we see here is the tremolo valve. Alright, now moving on to the Fender Super Amp 5D4. Now we see 2 valves here in the preamp, and really it's because the total outputs for both valves here are wired in parallel. These 2 valves only equal a single gain stage. Also, the inputs are also in parallel. The third valve in this amplifier is the phase inverter, and the outputs of the phase inverter are wired in parallel, equaling a second gain stage. A total of 2 gain stages for the Fender Super 5D4. Moving on to the Pro 5C5, we see two preamp valves, V1 and V2, wired in parallel. The outputs are all wired in parallel, equaling only a single gain stage for the first two valves for all channels. Now, this is an early design. It's very peculiar. The inputs are actually wired in series, so it appears that they're driving each other in the phase inverter, but the outputs are wired in parallel, equaling only a single gain stage, leaving a total of two gain stages for the preamp of the Model 5C5. Alright, now for the 3 gain stage Fender Tweed amplifiers. Starting off with the Pro 5E5 circuit, we see the first two valves, all inputs wired in parallel and all outputs wired in parallel, making a total of a single gain stage for the first two valves. The third valve being the phase inverter, we see the first plate is wired in series with the second plate driving it, equaling a total of 2 gain stages, equaling a grand total of 3 gain stages for the Fender Pro amp Model 5E5. Moving on to the Fender Deluxe 5E3 circuit, we see the first valve, inputs are parallel, outputs are parallel, a single gain stage. The second valve, the phase inverter, once again, the evolution of the phase inverter. The interesting two-sided phase inverter where the first side actually drives the second side, so that's wired in series. All right, moving on to the 5E11 Vibrolux. The first valve we see here, the first side of the first valve is the inputs are wired in parallel, equaling a single gain stage. The second side of the first valve is operating the tremolo in this circuit. The second valve is the phase inverter. Once again, the first side of the phase inverter is driving the second side in series, equaling a total of 3 gain stages for the 5E11. Alright, now for the 4 gain stage Fender Tweed amplifiers. Starting off with the Bassman 5F6A. This schematic looks really familiar. I believe this is the famous model. It's supposed to be the greatest amp ever that Marshall copied. The first valve is wired in parallel, equaling a total of 1 gain stage. The second valve is the tone stack in this amp, and it's wired in series, the first side driving the other side, equaling a total of 2 gain stages for that valve. And the third valve, we see the typical phase inverter that we're used to looking at, where it's in parallel and it's only a single gain stage for that valve. So grand total of 4 gain stages. All right, now moving on to the Twin 5F8A. We've got a very similar thing going on here, virtually identical. The first gain stage is in parallel, equaling a single gain stage for the first valve. The second valve is the tone stack. It's in series, so the one side is driving the other, equaling 2 gain stages for that valve. The third valve is the phase inverter. It's wired in parallel, our typical phase inverter scenario here. Alright, now for the 5 gain stage Fender Tweed amplifiers. Starting off with the Pro 5E5, we see the first valve wired in parallel. We've got a total of 1 gain stage for that valve. The second valve we see wired in series, which this is the tone stack for this amplifier. The first side driving the second side, equaling a total of 2 gain stages. And then the third valve, we see a slightly different phase inverter approach here, with the first side of the phase inverter driving the second side of the phase inverter. A total of 2 gain stages for the phase inverter valve. A grand total of 5 gain stages here. Interesting the way they did that. Phase inverter really ultimately running off just the single plate. Apparently they were able to pull off the out of phase off the negative part that would normally go to ground, and then the positive side of the waveform off the other side of that valve. Alright, now moving on, most of these are configurations like that. The 5E4, we've got the first valve wired in parallel, a total of 1 gain stage for that valve. The second valve, once again, is the tone stack. We see that wired in series, the first side driving the second side, with a total of 2 gain stages for the tone stack valve. And then the third valve is the phase inverter, also wired in series. We see the first side driving the second side, equaling 2 gain stages for that valve. And that's a grand total of 5 gain stages for the 5E4A Fender Super Amp. Alright, moving on to the 5F4, we see the first valve wired in parallel, equaling 1 gain stage. The second valve is the tone stack in this amplifier, and it is certainly in series. The first side driving the second side, equaling 2 gain stages for that valve. The third valve is the phase inverter, once again wired in series. We see the first side driving the second side, equaling 2 gain stages for the phase inverter, a grand total of 5 gain stages for the 5F4 super amp. Moving on to the Fender Bandmaster 5E7, which is the real popular model. The first valve we see wired in parallel, equaling 1 gain stage for that valve. The second valve is the tone stack wired in series. The first side driving the second side, equaling a total of 2 gain stages for that valve. The third valve is the phase inverter wired in series. The first side driving the second side, equaling a total of 2 gain stages for that valve. A total of 5 gain stages for the Bandmaster 5E7. Please keep in mind that gain structure doesn't always equal a higher gain factor. Resistor values, capacitor values, and tube values all work together with the gain structure to complete and create the total gain factor. Thanks for watching, and check our channel for our latest videos.